To tell the story or not to tell the story? The question of uncovering the abuse story in sexual trauma therapy. So where does this question even come from? If you haven't worked much with survivors, it may be news to you that there even is a question about whether or not and when to bring up a story of exactly what happened, whether it's recounting an individual sexual assault or a series of abuses. I know from my experience, when I first started working with survivors, I felt so guilty bringing it up because it obviously caused them so much pain to recall. But is it a pain that's worth it? That's the ultimate question. Can there be healing without telling the story? As we've said, the story can be an event or a series of events. When a survivor tells their story, remember, this is not like recounting their last visit to the grocery store. This is a story that more than likely will bring back traumatization due to post-traumatic stress. That means a survivor might feel like they're re-experiencing what happened to them all over again. They may remember physical and emotional pain. They will certainly remember feeling shame and perhaps guilt as well. No one really wants to go there, but should we ask them to anyway? Here are a few reasons that we might want to. First, hidden beliefs and assumptions. When the client first experiences the sexual trauma or abuse, they are seeing it through the eyes of someone who's currently being traumatized, likely in shock. On top of that, some survivors are children when the abuse happens, meaning they see the experience with the child's perspective, which, as we all know, is vastly different from the experience of an adult. How can these hidden beliefs be brought to the surface? Usually the best way to do that is through retelling the story. This allows the therapist to provide an adult perspective on a thoroughly ingrained mindset that a person has likely had for many years, maybe allowing the client for the first time to see another possible truth. As you can probably tell, that reason alone lets me think in most cases telling the story is the right way to go. But you always have to have caution with that because there's a very real threat of re-traumatization or the story getting away from you. You want to be careful not to try to push a person to tell their story right away. Some of them may go ahead and spill it at the first session, and if they do, use your clinical judgment. But you don't want to force it. The person needs to have a choice in this area, as in many therapeutic avenues, because in a significant way, their choices were once taken away. So speak to them as a collaborator. Tell them why you think it's important for them to go into their story. Obtain permission to ask about traumatic past events before you do it. And start with something easy. It doesn't have to be a linear story, and in fact, in most cases, it just won't be. You may, for example, process the aftermath of the assault weeks before the assault itself, and that's okay. No one's giving points for chronology here. In this and in all therapy, be proactive with self-care on both of your parts. Encourage the client to verbalize a specific act of self-care they will pursue after you rehash a difficult experience. Something physically and emotionally nurturing, perhaps even slightly childlike, like curling up with a soft blanket. Watch your own physical and emotional reaction and make sure you're taking care of yourself. If you don't do it, you and the client can both suffer. I used to feel so guilty for encouraging people to tell their stories, but now I've seen how successful it can make the therapy process. I worked with the client for nearly a year before I successfully convinced them to carefully relive the incident that occurred to them as a child. At over 50 years old, this was the first time the person stopped insisting that they could have protected themselves as a 6-year-old child. Let me say this another way. It took over 40 years for this person to revisit their traumatic experience and accept that a child could not defend themselves against adults. I still get chills when I remember the wonder in their voice as they said, I really couldn't have done anything. Another survivor I worked with for an extensive period of time regularly blocked all attempts at help, despite coming into therapy week to week. They wanted to get help, but they were afraid to let their guard down. Once they acknowledged through the story of what happened that it was abuse that happened, that it wasn't a misunderstanding, but it was really abuse, their progress accelerated remarkably. And that fact wouldn't have made it into their heads without going through the story again. I hope you've been enjoying this series. If you have, just let me know by sharing a comment below. I'll be wrapping up next week with the final installment, Goals of Sexual Trauma Therapy. When are you done?